Chapter 19, The Heart, Part 1. So, where is the heart located? Here's a lovely, clean-looking heart, probably too clean because there should be some fatty tissue on it. Where is it found? Hopefully you got it right. It's found in the thoracic cavity. So in the chest cavity, the thoracic cavity, toward the midline, although the heart is a little larger on its left side. And also the heart is found in the pericardial cavity. Pericardial cavity formed by that fibrous sac that surrounds the heart. So the heart is in the thoracic cavity and the pericardial cavity. Here is a view, another view of the thoracic cavity. Here's the lungs. Here is where the heart is, but we cannot see it clearly because of the pericardium. Pericardium, that fibrous sac that surrounds the heart. Pericardium is two layers. The superficial layer is the fibrous pericardium. This is tough, dense, irregular connective tissue, very strong. And the second layer is the serous pericardium. So a serous membrane, a serous pericardium, which is got two layers, one layer lying on the surface of the heart, the other layer lying next to the fibrous pericardium, and then there's a space between them, and in that space is some fluid. Serous pericardium, of course, being very important because it prevents damage by friction. It basically lubricates the heart, so as it's constantly moving and beating, it doesn't rub against hard structures in the thoracic cavity. So here is the serous pericardium. Here's the heart. Push the heart into the serous pericardium. We have the visceral layer lying on the surface of the heart, the parietal layer on the outside exposed to the surrounding structures, and the cavity with a little bit of serous fluid, again providing lubrication to prevent friction. Next up is the layers of the heart wall. The heart wall has three main layers. The superficial layer is the epicardium. So the epicardium is the very superficial layer of the heart wall. It is made up of the visceral layer of the pericardium and also additional connective tissue, adipose tissue. So the epicardium is the visceral layer of the pericardium and also extra fatty tissue, extra adipose tissue. And this helps to provide a cushion for the heart and to hold structures to the surface of the heart. The biggest layer is the myocardium. The myocardium is where all the cardiac muscle tissue is found. So the heart is basically a big muscular pump. The myocardium is where you find all of that cardiac muscle tissue. And then the deepest layer is the endocardium. Endocardium is a thin layer that lines the inner surfaces of the heart, and it's nice and smooth, and it helps to reduce friction in the chambers of the heart. So when the blood cells are rushing through the heart, there's no rough surface for them to collide and stick to. Instead, it's all nice and smooth. Here's another image of a heart that's been cut open. The endocardium, again, is that smooth lining on the inside. The myocardium, the thickest layer with all that cardiac muscle tissue. And then the epicardium, the visceral layer of the pericardium, as well as additional fatty tissue, additional adipose tissue. The heart has four chambers. It has a right atrium, a left atrium, a right ventricle, and a left ventricle. The atria are more superior, ventricles are more inferior, and they actually function as two separate pumps. So the right atrium, right ventricle is one pump, left atrium, left ventricle is a second pump. If you look on the surface of the heart, you can see that it ends with a little bit of a point. That point is the apex. And then also on the surface are these little flaps that are part of the heart. They are called the auricles. So we have a right auricle and a left auricle. The function of the auricles is to increase the volume of the atrium. The right atrium is volumes increased by the right auricle, left atrium is volumes increased by the left auricle. If we open up the right atrium, here's the right atrium, we see that it has openings for three main large veins. There's the openings for the superior vena cava, the opening for the inferior vena cava, and the opening for the coronary sinus. So those are the veins that carry blood into the right atrium. Then there's another opening that leads to the tricuspid valve that connects the atrium to the right ventricle. So now we're looking at the right ventricle. Here is that tricuspid valve again. Within the ventricle, we also see these little string-like structures. These string-like structures are called the chordae tendineae, the heart cords. The chordae tendineae connect the cusps, the flaps of the tricuspid valve to these little muscles on the wall of the ventricle. These little muscles are called the papillary muscles. So the chordae tendineae attach the tricuspid valve to the papillary muscles. The wall of muscle tissue that separates the right ventricle from the left ventricle is called the interventricular septum. Inter for between, ventricular between the ventricles, septum for wall. At the superior end of the right ventricle, we have another valve. This is the pulmonary valve. And the pulmonary valve is basically at the border between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. So deoxygenated blood leaves the right ventricle, passes through the pulmonary trunk valve, and enters the pulmonary trunk, which is an artery. Blood will then split off the pulmonary trunk into the right and left pulmonary arteries. The deoxygenated blood goes to the lungs, gets oxygenated, and then oxygenated blood gets carried back to the heart by the pulmonary veins. Worth noting, pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries are blue colored because they're carrying deoxygenated blood. Pulmonary veins are red colored because they're carrying oxygenated blood. This is just an artifice, a fake thing that we have decided to do to distinguish vessels carrying oxygenated blood from vessels carrying deoxygenated blood. All right, here is the left atrium. Left atrium has openings for the left and right pulmonary veins. Those are the veins that empty blood into the left atrium. Then between the left atrium and the left ventricle is the bicuspid valve, also known as the mitral valve. The bicuspid valve has two cusps or flaps, and surprise, surprise, they have the chordae tendineae that attach to the papillary muscles. So within the left ventricle, coming off of the bicuspid valve are the chordae tendineae that attach to the papillary muscles on the walls of the left ventricle. Again, similar to the right ventricle. And then also, of course, the big interventricular septum still present. And then deep in there, you can't see it that well in this image, but deep in there is another valve, the aortic valve. The aortic valve lies between the aorta and the left ventricle. So as blood leaves the left ventricle, it goes up and passes through the aortic valve and enters the ascending aorta. So this is how we get the two pumps. We have the right pump, where it carries deoxygenated blood from the body to the right atrium. The deoxygenated blood then goes to the right ventricle and then leaves the pulmonary trunk to go to the lungs. This is the pulmonary circulation, carrying deoxygenated blood through the right side of the heart to the lungs. There the blood gets oxygenated and travels back to the left atrium. So oxygenated blood enters the left atrium, enters the left ventricle, and then leaves and goes to all the different parts of the body through the aorta and so forth. So this is systemic circulation, carrying oxygenated blood from the left side of the heart to the entire body so that the body cells can get the oxygen they need. And it just goes around and around between those two circulations, pulmonary and systemic. So now I'm going to go through the blood flow through the heart, the direction that blood flows. So this will be as if we're following a single red blood cell. So a single red blood cell will arrive in the right atrium, either from the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, or coronary sinus. One of those three veins will empty that red blood cell into the right atrium. That red blood cell will then travel through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. And then it will go, and again, this is all deoxygenated blood that came from the body. So this is deoxygenated blood. So a deoxygenated red blood cell enters the right ventricle. From there, it'll pass through the pulmonary valve and into the pulmonary trunk. That red blood cell will then travel by right or left pulmonary artery to the lungs. So again, pulmonary trunk carrying deoxygenated blood to the lungs. Go through the pulmonary circuit, become oxygenated, And then that red blood cell will arrive oxygenated and in the left atrium. It will then pass through the mitral or bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. And then that oxygenated red blood cell will leave the ventricle through the aortic valve, enter the aorta, and travel all throughout the body to deliver that oxygen. And that's the systemic circuit, carrying the blood all throughout the body to get oxygen and nutrients to our tissues. And then in the end, that same red blood cell will end up deoxygenated and back in the right atrium to go on and on, around and around in this continuous cycle between the two circulations. All right, so if we did a transverse section of the heart and looked at the ventricles, we would see that the left ventricle has much thicker myocardium, a much thicker wall than the right ventricle. So the left ventricle is much thicker, much more cardiac muscle tissue than the right ventricle. This is because the right ventricle is only sending blood to the lungs. Lungs are not that far away, do not need a lot of pressure, a lot of force to get the blood to the lungs and back. On the other hand, the left ventricle is sending blood all throughout the body, from the top of our head to the bottom of our feet. So that ventricle needs a lot of muscle tissue because there's a lot of force, a lot of blood pressure needed to move those fluids throughout the entire body. That is why the left ventricle is thicker, because it has a harder job moving blood throughout the entire body. All right, the valves. The valves are not all identical. They come in two big categories, the atrioventricular valves, the valves between the atrium and ventricle. This includes the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve. Tricuspid valve has three little flaps or cusps. Bicuspid valve has two little flaps or cups. When blood is going from the atrium to the ventricle, the valve will be open and blood will easily pass through into the ventricle. Then, when the ventricle contracts and starts to push blood out of itself, the valve will close. The flaps, the cusps will come together, blocking blood from going back into the atrium. And the chordae tendineae, those little strings, are what help keep the flaps from inverting. So they prevent that inversion so that the valve is able to effectively prevent backflow into the atrium. We don't want that. That would not be very efficient. Semilunar valves. The semilunar valves consist of the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve. Semilunar valves have these three little pockets lying on the sides of the border between the ventricle and the artery that it's going to. Here's what they look like. Three, again, little pockets. And basically what happens is when the ventricle contracts, blood gets forced out. These pockets lie flat against the sides of the artery. And then when the ventricle relaxes, blood will backflow a little bit. It'll fill up these little pouches, causing the valve to close, preventing blood from backflowing into the ventricle. Again, we do not want that. We do not want the valve to backflow into the ventricle. Heart murmur. You might have heard about a heart murmur. It's an abnormal sound to the heart's beat. And it turns out a heart murmur is caused by defective valves. One or more of the valves is defective, either via stenosis. Stenosis is when the heart valve's opening is narrowed, maybe by congenital disorder, maybe by scar tissue forming, basically meaning that it's harder for blood to get through that valve and it makes a strange little sound. Other possibility is insufficiency. Here the valve does not close completely, and this means that blood is backflowing, and that of course means the heart is not functioning as efficiently. So mitral insufficiency means that blood is backflowing from the left ventricle back into the left atrium because it doesn't close properly. If it's causing no problems, if it's just a strange sound, then nothing happens but being aware of it and paying attention to it. But if it causes significant problems for the person, then it can be surgically repaired or replaced. And that will be it for this part of Chapter 19.